Okay, welcome to The Whole Itself Remains. I'm your host, Todd Caldecott, and you're listening to CJMP Co-op Radio 90.1 FM, broadcasting from the Qathet region on the beautiful Sunshine Coast of British Columbia, on the traditional territory of the Cl.H people. This show is part of a weekly Q&A series where subscribers can join me each Wednesday to explore health, healing, and human wholeness. And after the broadcast, we dive deeper into a 30 to 60 minute Q&A where subscribers can ask me anything, be it personal, clinical, or even philosophical. I'll do my best to answer. So this is our last show of this particular semester, let's call it. This is the spring semester of the Q&A session, and it's the last one, and we'll be picking up again in, just basically in September. So we all need to have a summer break, I think. You guys too, me also. Spend some more time in the garden, paddleboarding, and also just some various different activities. Like next week, I'm heading off to the Kootenai Herb Gathering, where I'm delivering a couple lectures and looking forward to that. So yeah, we're going to be taking a little bit of a break. And for today's show, I'm going to do something of a roundup. I'm going to answer a question I received recently. A question that someone wanted me to answer on the show about a health issue and some general guidance. And then, I'm always looking through different media stories to find things that might be of interest. And so I've selected a few I thought that would be of interest to listeners, things that I can use as a jumping off point to discuss other issues. So just kind of a media roundup before we end things up for this show and then continue on to the live Q&A. So let's proceed with that. So I do have a question here. So someone asked me, it was via Instagram, what Ayurvedic medicine and what does your experience have to say about sugar craving and mild headaches when feeling hungry? So yeah, this is a pretty common issue. It's something that a lot of people struggle with, and essentially is probably related to a case of hypoglycemia or low blood sugar. So typically when we eat some kind of rapidly digesting carbohydrate, then our blood sugar levels will increase. And if we're not diabetic, then our pancreas will pump out insulin. And the job of insulin is to gather up those absorbed nutrients and store them so that they can be utilized for energy later. Or processed in whatever way, depending on whether it's a carbohydrate, it's a fat, or it's a protein. Now, if it's a carbohydrate, then typically it stimulates a profound release of insulin. And this is for a few really important reasons. Number one, on an evolutionary basis, our bodies aren't used to big dumps of refined carbohydrate that dramatically increases our blood glucose. That is very unusual in the history of human experience on Earth. And you can simply see that if you go off into the forest, wherever you are. It doesn't really matter wherever you are, but if you go off into the forest and you look for sources of digestible carbohydrate, you're not going to find many. Now, you might find some at certain times of the year, primarily as different fruits. Like right now, the local salmon berries are just coming into fruit. And, while they certainly do have some simple carbohydrate, some fructose, they're not particularly high. I think most of us that have nibbled on some salmon berries have noticed that in most cases they're a little sour, even a little bit bitter. Occasionally you'll find a really ripe one that's quite sweet. But if you were to spend some time eating wild picked salmon berries, it's not going to dramatically impact your blood sugar. It will, but it's not going to do it dramatically because the sugar content of that fruit isn't all that high. And that is the case with all wild fruit. Now, of course, what we've done over thousands of years of selection and hybridization is take these wild fruits and turn them into much sweeter versions of their ancestral source, thereby driving up the sugar content. Some people say, oh, this is genetic modification. This isn't genetic modification. This is simply just the normal processes that farmers employ, plant breeders employ, of just selection and hybridization to develop these different varieties that are essentially sweeter. And over time, we have dramatically increased the sugar content of these various foods. Such that it is completely out of context of the original production of these sugars in these wild fruits. So we have distorted the level of sugar content in these fruits through different human interventions. And obviously there's some benefits to that, but the downside is that now when we consume these fruits, it has this notable impact on our blood sugar. And to our bodies, which are really ancient creatures, right? Our genome hasn't evolved all that much since the Paleolithic, that our bodies are simply not used to accommodating that. And so our bodies will pump out a huge amount of insulin to drive down those sugars. And so that's a normal biological response, but it's also one that's rooted in a biological reality that high blood sugars increase your risk of infection. And you will know that, for example, if you ever met someone that is a diabetic, maybe they've been in a merge, or, God forbid, they've had some type of intervention where they've had to lose like a limb, like maybe a toe, because of gangrene. This occurs because these folks lack the ability to lower blood sugar, that their pancreas is no longer functioning, so they don't pump out sufficient or any insulin to drive those sugars lower. The sugars increase, and it causes a ketoacidosis, and then that's a life-threatening complication of untreated diabetes. So one of the reasons why the body does that is because if you have high blood sugar, it does increase your risk of infection. Having sweet blood, all that sugar in your blood, it just makes you that much tastier for microorganisms to invade, inhabit, reproduce, divide, and essentially take over your body. And of course, your immune system doesn't like that. And you have a certain level of bacterial load or septicemia in your blood, then of course the body will just shut down. Will go into like a severe inflammatory crisis, and the result typically is death. So the body's very conservative. It does not like to have high blood sugar because of this risk of infection. So if you eat something, these rapidly digesting carbohydrate, that's out of context with the evolutionary paradigm, there will be this profound release of insulin, and then it'll drive your blood sugar down, and then you will be hypoglycemic. And that typically is what is happening when someone experiences this issue maybe an hour and a half later after eating a carbohydrate-based meal, typically breakfast. This is a big change that's happened over the last 100 years. Where formerly people would eat things like, eggs and veggies, or steak and eggs, or kippers, some kind of heavy, protein-rich, fat-rich breakfast, often with some vegetables, just to sort of fill up the stomach. And to stretch the meal a little bit further. That's what your typical farmer would eat, or a person that was a laborer. But of course, around about 100 years ago, there was this big change in industry, in society, to encourage people to stop eating these foods, purportedly because they were unhealthy, and switch to foods like breakfast cereal and toast. We've all seen those commercials of breakfast cereal. You see the bowl of cornflakes with a couple strawberries chopped into it, a glass of orange juice, and a little stack of toast, part of a complete breakfast. There's nothing that is complete about that breakfast. It is rich in carbohydrate. And what's going to happen is that immediately after consuming, your blood sugars are going to increase dramatically. If you're not diabetic, you're going to pump out a whole bunch of insulin. That's going to drive your blood sugar down, and then you're going to be hypoglycemic. And so your brain will be starved of sugar because of that hypoglycemic response. It's reactive hypoglycemia. And that is typically the cause of this headache that people get. So it's an easily solvable problem, which is that don't start your day off eating that type of food. It is not a good way to start your day. Many years ago, I wrote a blog post on breakfast, and it's probably one of the most important interventions that I see that anyone can follow on a regular basis, is to make sure that you're consuming as the first meal, whenever you consume it, that it is not something that is going to jack up your blood sugar and lead to this reactive hypoglycemic pattern. I discovered this many years ago when I had little kids and I was sending them off to school, and I would make them oatmeal. It was easy to get them to eat oatmeal in the morning, and I would put some chopped apple, maybe a little bit of chopped almonds, roasted almonds in there that I had roasted. And then maybe a little bit of maple syrup and some butter, definitely tasty. And I would eat it, and then I would go to work. But then I would find that within an hour and a half or so, my blood sugar was crashing, and I had to rush off in between patients to go and grab a snack at the local cafe, come back, scarf that down, and then see the next patient, and then actually proceed to tell them not to do exactly what I had done. But the fact of the matter is that when you're in this reactive hypoglycemic pattern, all bets are off about how you're going to manage it. Most people are going to find ways to mediate that effect, and are going to eat whatever they need to, even whether or not it's a fully conscious choice. Because in many cases it's not. It's just a biological response. You're feeling crashed out, tired, fatigued, irritable, foggy, and so you need something. And so you go to the cafe, you grab a muffin, a coffee, and then you're fine for a little while. But of course, because that's the type of food you've chosen, this another carbohydrate, your blood sugar gets jacked back up again, and then you go through that same pattern of an insulin crash and then another reactive hypoglycemia. And so a lot of people are just on this roller coaster all day long. And so you can stop this pattern simply by eating more fat and protein for breakfast and keeping your carbohydrates relatively low. I asked a patient once, she was from Italy, about what do folks eat in Italy, because we were trying to work out some issues around her diet and sort of figure out some of these long held dietary patterns. And she was like, in Italy, we have like a pastry, we like have a coffee. And I pointed out to her that probably is not a traditional food. That's definitely an urbanized experience. That if you're a farmer, there's no way that you could have a pastry and a coffee and then go out and work for several hours without crashing out. And I pointed out to her, just imagine, you're marching the Roman legion across Europe to conquer different countries, and you feed your legionnaires, pastries and coffee. They're not going to get very far. And that's indeed not what the Roman army was fed. They were fed meat and cheese, and if it was some carbohydrate, it was a coarse barley bread. It was nothing similar to what we typically think of as a breakfast food here in North America. So this is one simple intervention that you can do that will dramatically improve your health overall. It'll set you up for good eating throughout the day, because if you're not in this reactive hypoglycemic pattern, then you're much less likely to reach for those foods that are just going to perpetuate that pattern. So it's a fantastic way, a simple intervention that can reset the flow of your entire day. And of course, if you're a student of mine, if you're a patient of mine, then you'll know that I'm also a big advocate of eating less frequently. People call it intermittent fasting. I'm simply following the model of Ayurveda, which suggests that you really shouldn't eat more than twice a day. And it's really difficult to do that if you have a big, starchy, carb-rich breakfast. Almost for sure, you're going to be eating at least 3, perhaps 4 or 5 times a day. And that's no way to manage your blood sugar. It's no way to manage things like anxiety. And I have many stories of being able to resolve someone's underlying anxiety, even depression, other issues, by having them make this switch. So this specific question, though, was asking about headaches. And yes, when the brain is deprived of sufficient glucose because of this reactive hypoglycemic pattern, it can definitely drive headaches. And where the headaches are occurring can also provide you with some additional information about what else might be going on. So in this case, upon further questioning, it was determined that the headaches were primarily located around the orbital of the eye and the temple. And this is the region of the head that's associated with migraine-like headaches. That might not be a full-blown migraine. Sometimes they occur bilaterally on both sides, but often just on one side, unilaterally. And definitely a reactive hypoglycemic pattern can be a trigger for this type of migraine-like headache. And it's typically because of this reactive hypoglycemic pattern. So instituting this type of change can go a long ways to resolving it, but also there's this correlation between that region of the head, the temple, and the eye, and the liver. Actually, in Chinese medicine, if you're at all familiar with acupressure, acupuncture, and the structure and flow of the different meridians of the body, the liver meridian ends in the pupil of the eye, and the gallbladder meridian ends in the corner of the eye. And they go up the back of the head. The gallbladder meridian actually zigzags across the temple before it lands in the corner of the eye. So any type of pain that's located in the ocular temporal region of the head is going to be associated with the liver. And typically in Chinese medicine, it would be a liver yang pattern, an ascending dysfunctional liver heat pattern, where there's some underlying liver stagnation that allows the heat to be driven upwards into the body instead of downwards and out of the body where it should flow. So what I might do in this circumstance too is, apart from making or instituting this type of change in terms of how you consume breakfast and what types of foods, I would also provide some herbs, for example, to decongest the liver and remove that liver stagnation, so that when the liver is in a state of crisis because of this deficiency pattern, this reactive hypoglycemic pattern, that it's not also going to drive this inflammatory response, which then causes these migraine-like symptoms. Okay, so hopefully that's helpful for this person. And let's get into some of the other things that I've come across recently. So this is a grab bag of different things I've come across. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen for those of you that are online, and you'll see it definitely on YouTube as well here. So this is a study that came out, Violence Alters Human Genes for Generations, Researchers Discover. Now, the headline probably isn't exactly correct, because it's not so much that violence alters fundamentally the genes, but more their expression, the expression of those genes. So the difference between genetics and epigenetics. So we're not fundamentally changing the genes, but we are changing in terms of how they are expressed. And so this was a groundbreaking study that provided the first human evidence, and was published earlier this year, that trauma from violence can cause epigenetic changes. So these are chemical modifications to DNA that affect the gene activity without altering the gene sequence, that are passed down for generations. So the focus here was on 3 generations of Syrian families, those that were affected by the 1982 Hama massacre and then also the recent civil war. So it was found that grandchildren of women pregnant during the Hama siege showed 14 epigenetic modifications in their DNA despite never directly experiencing the violence. Now, people that had personally endured the violence had 21 distinct epigenetic changes, and those exposed in utero showed accelerated biological aging, possibly raising risks for age-related diseases. So this is the first direct evidence in humans that violence can leave a heritable epigenetic mark. It can help to explain intergenerational cycles of trauma, poverty, and disease, and it clearly has implications for understanding the long-term biological impacts of all forms of violence, including domestic abuse and gun violence. And so, of course, there's still more questions to be asked. It's unknown how these epigenetic changes affect health through similar changes. Although similar changes have been linked to conditions like diabetes or obesity and other studies. So it's really interesting. I've observed this, for example, among Ashkenazi Jewish patients, that folks that grew up here or born here in North America, but whose grandparents went through the Holocaust, bear the impacts of that trauma and will often suffer at higher rates from things like anxiety and depression that aren't explainable by their direct personal life experience. Often these folks, at least in my practice, are, like most of us here in North America, are relatively privileged, have pretty good lives, have functional families, have employment, have financial means, and yet many of them are often plagued by this chronic anxiety, depression that doesn't seem to be explained by the condition of their lives. And research like this explains how these traumas can be passed down epigenetically. And even if it's not something so dramatic as like the Holocaust, you just imagine in a family lineage, say, a father that had experienced some type of abuse during his life, and then has his own children, and is a much better parent than he'd ever experienced, and in fact maybe was a very good parent in many different respects, but the kids growing up under him display some characteristics of having undergone some abuse or trauma, because this is passed on epigenetically. And this could be quite baffling. Because despite the fact that there's no direct one-to-one link or correspondence between these experiences, they can still filter through and pass through generations. Ayurveda, we describe this as the kutumba dosha, that disturbances within a family lineage affect and impact that lineage for generations to come. And there are a whole set of practices in Jyotish. This is the sort of spiritual astrological practices employed by astrologers. They're called Jyotisha. They will recommend all kinds of remediations, different practices, different rituals, etc., that are employed to appease the ancestors that have undergone this trauma, because it's thought that after someone dies, you have to imagine this doesn't happen in the same kind of like a linear time that we experience here in our everyday life. That once someone passes, they're kind of in an intermediary state whereby they still begin to affect the succeeding generations. And there's an amalgam of all of these traumas, these urges, these desires that remain unresolved in that generation that's passed, in that ancestral generation. And that the inheritors of that experience have to propitiate, have to satiate, have to make offerings to these ancestors to bring them peace, to help to give them what they need to alleviate their trauma, their sorrow, so that it doesn't continue to affect the current generation. Now, whether you believe that or not, there could be something that's just valid in being conscious of that connection and ritualizing it as a way to resolve it. But it's certainly going to be very dependent rather on one's personal experiences, one's cultural background. But it's a tradition or a practice that's not unique to India. It's also practiced in China, and other indigenous cultures also have this notion of ancestors that have departed that continue to affect the living generation, the current generation, and that we need to be aware of those traumas and find a way to resolve them. So it's just kind of an interesting thing that's important to be aware of, that sometimes in working through one's own personal traumas, they might not necessarily be linked to one's personal individual experience, but related to this notion of the kutumba dosha, of this ancestral lineage, and how epigenetically it continues to affect succeeding generations. I just find that kind of interesting. So moving on to the next thing I came across was, why are night owls at greater risk of depression? So it's something that's certainly been observed. There's another study I came out looking at recently that showed that night owls in general tend to be or have higher levels of intelligence. So why would they do it to themselves? Maybe they just don't know. But certainly there is this correlation between a higher level of intelligence and an increased risk of depression. But this was an interesting study. It showed that overall, night owls have a poor sleep quality. They tend to engage in unhelpful behaviors like alcohol consumption and employ maybe less mindfulness. And so while the study didn't show a cause and effect, it said targeting things like mindfulness, sleep, and alcohol use could reduce depression risk in night owls, particularly in young people. I would suggest that we need to rethink this whole notion of what it means to be a night owl, and that maybe the reason or the cause for the depression is just being out of sync with these natural circadian cycles. So independent of our own individual behaviors, we're part of this broad flow of life on Earth, and we are connected to that. And so that when we are living out of balance with or out of harmony with these natural circadian cycles, it's going to create some friction or tension, and that could be expressed in ourselves individually as depression or anxiety. So if you've been paying attention, you'll have heard me say before that I don't believe that there's anything naturally as a night owl, that the chronotype of a night owl is an artifact of our modern industrialized existence, and without influences like electricity, night owls simply would not exist. So I think that's important to be aware of. And there's also some research looking at night owls and sleep duration and quality, and certainly staying up late also impacts that as well. Once again, because you're not getting to bed at a time that is naturally conducive to having a good sleep, which typically is getting to bed somewhere between 10 and 11 at night, and then getting up sometime with the sun or shortly after the sunrise is the best for cognitive health and to decrease your risk of anxiety and depression. This next study, this is something I've observed for quite some time, so I was quite pleased to see this come out. Patients whose allergies cause the sniffles have different fungi living in their noses. This is particularly relevant because we're in a time of, at least here in the northern temperate area, we're right in the middle of allergy season. Where I am, the cottonwood trees are just pumping out all the cottonwood fluff, and you can see it everywhere. It's not at its peak yet, but it's accumulating. It can get so heavy that when I'm walking in the back there, back on my property where it's a cottonwood forest, it's like snow. There's so much of it. And people are always complaining about the cottonwood. They're like, oh man, that cottonwood fluff, it's getting everywhere. It's making me sneeze. But that's not the case. There's nothing antigenic about cottonwood fluff. It's just seeds. And of course, if you inhale one somehow and one gets up your nose, I'm sure you're going to sneeze. But what's happening concurrently is that the grass is also pollinating at the same time. And that's typically what people are reacting to, is the grass pollen. So they unfairly impugn the cottonwood fluff. It's not the cause, it's just associated or happens around the same time that the grass is pollinating. But that's what people are reacting to. But people that have allergies typically to grass pollen or suffer from rhinosinusitis probably have a diverse ecology of not just bacteria, but also many different types of fungi living in their noses. Back in the day, we used to call this candida, which is a type of yeast, but it's not simply candida. Candida can be present, but there's lots of other types of fungi that can be found living in the nose that work synergistically and collectively to induce this chronic inflammatory response, to deranged mucosal function that can lead to congestion, the blockage of the ostia that drain the sinuses, that can lead to the later development of polyps through an immunoreactive issue where the body is just reacting to these different microbes and wants to wall them off in these big blobs of polyps, essentially. So what I'm trying to say is that you want to make sure that you're treating the causes of the allergy. You want to obviously temporarily try to reduce your pollen exposure. But, and the number one thing that I typically see with grass pollen allergies is an overconsumption or exposure to other types of grasses in the diet. Primarily wheat is the number one. It's not just gluten, but wheat and wheat flour products in particular, and other wheat-related species. And because there's this cross-reactivity pattern typically with the A1 dairy, I will also remove that. And it's something that I follow. I used to be affected dramatically by seasonal allergies, by hay fever. My eyes would blow up. I would sneeze 40 times in a row. When I was a kid, I hated this time of year. I mean, I loved it because it was, good time to get outside and play. But I was so highly impacted by the allergies that it just often kept me in a state of misery. I don't have that issue anymore because I don't eat those foods on a regular basis. And I'm certainly very careful not to eat any of them as we move into this allergy season. But it's important to note that what might be predisposing you to this heightened mucosal reactivity is harboring a chronic fungal infection. And particularly if you've had issues with chronic sinusitis before and you've gone on rotating courses of antibiotics to treat it, then almost for sure you've got a chronic fungal rhinosinusitis that is fundamental to this issue. That is the primary issue that sometimes manifests with an overlapping secondary bacterial infection. Antibiotics are used to treat that. It goes away, but you have this chronic sniffles, congestion. It's almost for sure fungal. And typically one giveaway too is that these folks will often have a problem in the fall when there's no pollinating happening, but the mushrooms are releasing all their spores. And that typically also will see this pattern come up. So you kind of get these two major patterns for allergic rhinitis that happen in the spring and early summer where we are now, and then again in the fall. And then of course, if you have a chronic fungal rhinosinusitis, you could just have those symptoms all year round on some level, just kind of peaking in the spring and early summer and then again in the fall. So you need to treat that issue. Now, I said it's more complicated than just a candida infection, but that so-called candida diet is going to be helpful here. So apart from avoiding the flour products, the dairy, you want to avoid all of the sugar, sweet foods, even very sweet fruit, dried fruit, any type of yeasted food. It includes wine and beer, as well as things like kombucha or water kefir. And then you can employ medications, herbal medications, to treat it. We'll use medicated oils that have antifungal components applied as a treatment called nasya. We use it in Ayurveda. And then internally, a variety of herbs that help to inhibit fungal growth and replication and help to decongest the mucosa. So herbs, for example, like bayberry, mullein, golden seal, or that one's a little pricey and difficult to find these days. So you can also use like the Oregon grape instead. They're all very helpful to resolve this issue, but the key thing is to make sure you employ those changes in your diet, because the fungi are the growth of these fungi are dependent upon the substrate, and the substrate is your mucosa and whatever you're excreting through your mucosa, which is coming from your diet. So you reduce all those sweet, easily digestible carbohydrates and starches, and you will get some improvement, almost for sure. Let's see, we've got just 20 minutes here, so I want to make sure I cover all the things I wanted to cover. There's this quick note here about tattoos may be linked to an increased risk of cancer. So there is some research showing that tattoo ink may increase the risk of skin and lymphoma cancer. And it's because the tattoo ink accumulates in the lymph nodes. So it does raise some questions about the long-term effects of tattoos. I understand why people get them. Obviously they have this aesthetic value, and probably a few small tattoos are unlikely to create or increase risk all that much. But it's something to watch for sure. If you are heavily tattooed, that there may be an increase in the risk of skin cancer and or lymphoma. And so if you are contemplating getting a tattoo, then this might be an important consideration, particularly if you have a family history of skin cancer or lymphoma. That would be reasonably a good contraindication. Now, if you are already tattooed and are concerned about this, then you want to make sure you're employing whatever measures you can to reduce your cancer risk overall, consuming vitamin D3 and flavonoids and polyphenols and other antioxidant compounds, and judicious exposure to the sun, etc., etc. Those are all things that you can do. Medicinal plants like the medicinal fungi and other immunomodulating herbs are going to be helpful here too. But prevention is the best here. So it's probably good to be a little judicious when considering tattoos. I know it's become something of a cultural trend, particularly among the millennial generation. I see lots of folks, millennials, that have tattoos. Yeah, and if you've got them, you've got them. But if you're thinking about getting some, maybe just think twice, especially if you have a family history of skin cancer, lymphoma. This next study is vitamin D supplements show signs of protection against biological aging. So this was a randomized controlled trial. It revealed that vitamin D supplementation helped to maintain telomere length. And so these are the protective caps at the end of chromosomes. They tend to shorten with aging, and they're linked to the development of certain diseases. So it showed that when we ensure that we're getting adequate vitamin D, which is 40 nanograms per liter, that our risk of aging, of telomere shortening, and its effects on brain health are reduced. So you want to make sure that you are supplementing with vitamin D. They also looked at omega-3 fatty acids. They didn't see the same benefit in omega-3 fatty acids as they saw with vitamin D. Now, that could be that many of the omega-3 fatty acid supplements that are out there aren't all that good quality. They are the ethyl ester form. It's this refined form, and they don't act in the same biological way as the essential fatty acids when they are in their reesterified or triglyceride form. So that's one thing I would suggest if you're going to take an essential fatty acid supplement, that you make sure you're taking the reesterified or triglyceride form. But then there's also some additional research showing that that a lot of the benefits of N3 fatty acids, the omega-3 fatty acids, are mostly found in people that consume those foods in their diet rather than taking a supplement. And then again, the issue here is you want to make sure you're not consuming much of the N6 fatty acids. You need some, but of course the modern or the standard American diet is skewed so heavily in favor of N6 fatty acids because of these refined vegetable seed oils that it necessitates taking an N3 fatty acid supplement. But if you simply don't eat those refined vegetable oils, then you probably don't even need to take an essential fatty acid supplement. You can just get it in your diet by eating, grass-fed, pastured meat, wild fish, pastured eggs, and then getting plenty of leafy greens. Different, seaweed is helpful, and there's different types of seeds like hemp or chia or flax, although it's not particularly efficient to get them in that form, but they still contribute overall to the pool of N3 fatty acids. That is probably your best bet. But vitamin D3 is not something that you can get easily from your diet. Mostly we get it through synthesis in our skin. It's a photosynthetic reaction from our skin's exposure to ultraviolet B light. It interacts with 7-dehydrocholesterol and turns into this precursor form of vitamin A, which eventually gets converted into its hormone form, which then exerts all these beneficially protective effects in the body, as well as plays a role in calcium absorption. So it's hard to get the vitamin D3 in your diet. There's small amounts in things like liver or bone broth or a little oily fish, but it's difficult to get adequate amounts. So it's one simple intervention that you can employ. I would say where I am in temperate North America and the Pacific Northwest, you can tell if you need vitamin D. You're not making it from the sun. If you go outside and at noon you look at the length of your shadow, if it is longer than the height of your body, i.e. it is less than a 45-degree angle, then you are not going to be making any vitamin D. All right? So that's basically from about early September to late April where I live. Now, if you live further south, maybe you live in California, then the season during which you can make vitamin D is longer for sure. But there's still usually a couple of months in December, January where you cannot, and you probably need to supplement. And certainly if you wear sunscreen or you practice some degree of sun avoidance, then it's obviously not going to be helpful. So vitamin D here, really important to prevent brain aging. Oh, this was, I thought this was kind of interesting. Grocery prices set to rise as soil becomes unproductive. So, of course, grocery prices might be rising for all kinds of reasons, particularly in the States, as they deport all of these immigrant workers. Who's going to pick the food rotting in the fields? That's a major existential issue. But underlying that is this long-term reliance on NPK fertilizer to grow our food. And there's already evidence that since colonization, we've lost several feet of topsoil. You can see this in satellite photos when farmers are preparing their fields. So they're tilling their fields, and you can see these massive dust clouds of dirt that are just blown away off their fields. And because of this monoculture approach, this industrial model of agriculture, it doesn't conserve soil, and we are completely dependent upon NPK fertilizer to grow the crops instead of the actual nutrition within the soil itself. And that's one of the reasons why you see a really dramatic increase in nutrient density in permaculture grown, organically grown vegetables. Sometimes upwards of 400% increase in nutrient density because of this care and nourishment of the soil. It's something that every traditional farmer valued. It wasn't just the crops that were growing, but the soil itself. It's no different than, say, you're working with someone who's infertile. The health of the uterus and the reproductive cycle are going to be essential to ensuring fertility. So likewise is the same with the care of the soil. And so this is a really concerning issue because it doesn't seem like we are doing anything about this. And we have so many people in the world that are dependent upon this mass industrialized form of agriculture that if we switched or we stopped or went to another model, that we wouldn't have enough food to feed people. They actually conducted this little experiment in Sri Lanka. The newly elected government decided they would go completely organic, which is a great and important idea, except that it reduced their food productivity dramatically, and they couldn't feed themselves to the same extent. So we're going to have to put our heads together and really think about this problem. And I think that wherever you can, what it means that you want to support small-scale local farmers who have a vested interest in taking care of their soil, that practice things like composting and these different permaculture practices to ensure that there is plenty of nutrient density, healthy microbiome, healthy soil ecology, because that in turn will impact the quality of the food. So hopefully that's something that we can be looking at in the succeeding years and generations, is to get off of this industrial model and this complete reliance on NPK and switch back to a more sustainable model of farming, which I think probably means upending this whole concept of industrial monoculture crops. This next study, Western diet causes inflammation where a traditional African food or diet protects. So this was a study from Tanzania. It found that a switch of just 2 weeks from a traditional African diet to a Western diet causes inflammation, reduces the immune response to pathogens. It activates processes associated with lifestyle disease, whereas an African diet rich in vegetables, fiber, fermented foods has a positive effect. So in just 2 weeks of switching, a diet from, going from this traditional African diet full of vegetables, fiber, fermented foods to a Western diet, increases inflammation. And likewise, if you flip it, if you go from this Western diet back to traditional African diet, you'll regain or restore immunological health, and inflammation will reduce as a result. That seems pretty obvious. Probably a lot of this is mediated through the microbiome. Of course, all those vegetables, vegetable fibers, and then probiotic foods are going to ensure a healthy gut microbiome, which modulates, mediates the inflammatory response. Really important here. The reason why I found this, because it plays into this next study looking at low carb diets. So we started talking about this, about how a low carb approach, particularly for breakfast, can be very helpful to promote neurological stability that can address things like chronic anxiety. So this is some research showing that a low carb diet is linked to reduced depressive symptoms. But what it goes on to say is that only if those low carb diets are paired with plant foods, and in particular plant fiber. If they're a diet that is low carb, that is the so-called lion diet, I guess, or the carnivore diet, that's just meat or some type of animal product without the plant material, that it doesn't have those benefits. And that's certainly something I have observed as well. And it's been concerning for me as I've watched these dietary fads come and go, that people have embraced this keto lifestyle, and a strict ketogenic diet typically recommends that you avoid any type of plant food. Now, I don't think there's any reason, even in someone that requires a medically supervised ketogenic diet, I still think there's room to provide some vegetation, because things like above ground vegetables like kale or zucchini, green beans, there's a tiny bit of carbohydrate, but mostly fiber. It's not going to have a significant impact on blood sugar, and therefore you'll still be in ketosis. But this extreme form of the diet that I don't even recommend for someone that has, like, say, epilepsy or a brain tumor like glioblastoma, are following it just as a healthy lifestyle or choice, or to help them lose weight. And it certainly can be effective. But what I typically see is that these people become progressively more intolerant to plant foods, such that if they try to eat some plant food, they'll have a big reaction. It's usually mediated by the gut, because following a carnivore diet, a high fat, high protein, low plant food diet, it changes your microbiome. And therefore you become somewhat intolerant to these plant fibers. But that's not the solution, because as you can see here, that it actually doesn't help to improve long-term health, that it will lead to issues like an increased risk of depression. So yes, you can follow a low carb diet and even a ketogenic diet, although I don't recommend it unless there's a specific medical reason to do so. But following a generally low carb diet is I find that's more reflective of our evolutionary pattern, Makes a lot of sense. Remember, those carbohydrates and starches aren't just freely available in nature. We have modified our relationship with these foods to increase starch and carbohydrate content, but with big impacts on our overall metabolic health. But the key thing here is you want to make sure that you're eating plenty of these plant fibers, these plant foods. And there's some upsides, not just in terms of providing all of these anti-inflammatory components, these antioxidants, its beneficial effect on the gut microbiome, which helps to mediate the inflammatory response. But the other thing is that it just helps to fill you up, right? So those plant fibers provide more bulk, because that's the reason why typically people will go for things like rapid digesting starches like potato, pasta, rice. When you go to a restaurant that's a cheap restaurant, you're not paying very much, they give you that stuff. They give you a bunch of fries, they give you a bunch of rice. And you know it's a cheap restaurant when you get a big pile of rice, right? Because they're just trying to fill you up so you leave there feeling full. And that's a strategy if you're poor. But it doesn't work very well because, of course, those starches get digested rapidly, and then you have this hypoglycemic response, and then you need more. And then you're on this roller coaster pattern that we don't want you to be on. So include those plant-based foods. Please do not follow that carnivore diet. And if you're following it because you're stuck on it, right? You're stuck on it now because you're intolerant to plant fibers. That's something that you can help to regain in a stepwise fashion to help regain your tolerance and shift your microbiome in favor of being able to digest these plant fibers, because that's really important. And why is that important? Well, that plays into this next study here. Per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, PFAS chemicals. These are the forever chemicals. In circulation in a Canadian population. It's a study that looked at the association with serum liver enzyme biomarkers and looked at a novel method to reduce serum PFAS chemicals, these forever chemicals that we know are linked to endocrine disruption, that we know are linked to cancer. What the research shows is that we can decrease the levels of these compounds in our blood by consuming fiber. And that if we're not consuming fiber, that we're not being able to properly discharge and get rid of these toxins in our bodies. So that's one of the other key benefits of making sure that you're consuming plant foods. It's not just my bias as a herbalist. I want to see everyone consuming plants, and because I just know of the overall benefits of a plant-based diet, not exclusively plant-based, but I eat meat and animal proteins, eggs and whatnot, but I eat lots and lots of plant foods to counterbalance those heavier, dense foods. It's like the yin to the yang, essentially. So all those other benefits that I mentioned in terms of supporting the microbiome, of filling you up, reducing inflammation, etc. The other benefit here is just that they have this detoxifying effect that really can't be obtained in any other way by having a healthy gut microbiome that is mediated and supported by consuming plenty of plant fiber. So, more reasons to make sure that you don't follow these silly carnivore diets for very long before you start reintroducing some plant fibers. Now, you will remember, if you've been following along, I one of the first things I talked about in this podcast series was small intestine bacterial overgrowth, where you've got an overgrowth of bacteria in the small intestine. It's such that when you eat fiber-rich food, the bacteria in your small intestine begin to ferment that, create gas and bloating in an organ in the small intestine that can't accommodate all of that gas and bloating. It's very uncomfortable and painful. So there may be a period of time while we are shifting the microbiome, while we are inhibiting those bacteria in the small intestine, where you're not eating much in the way of plant fiber. But that's only for a few weeks, typically, before we can start to rotate back in some plant fiber. Maybe some small amounts of some live culture fermented foods, for example, would also be helpful. Not typically at the outset, because those bacteria, even if they're healthy bacteria, they're in the wrong place. There's too many healthy bacteria in the small intestine where they shouldn't be. They should be lower down in the large intestine. So withdrawal of those live culture foods and plant fibers for a duration of time, while we draw our attention to inhibiting those organisms, while we support the function of digestion, gastric acid secretion, hepatobiliary secretion, etc. While we work on those elements, and inhibit those microorganisms, we might reduce the fiber, even eliminate it temporarily, or limit it to the kind of what I call very tender vegetables. So instead of like a kale or whatever, you're going to have like baby bok choy instead. I mean, zucchini is a good one, but tender vegetables that don't have a lot of gnarly fiber, or what my grandmother used to call roughage, you want to limit those. But eventually you want to come back to those types of foods. Because when you look at our diet now, even the so-called healthy diet, it is still deficient in fiber when you compare it to, say, that traditional African diet, or you look at our early hunter-gatherer Paleolithic diet. They ate much more fiber than we nowadays, even in a healthy individual. So that's something we can certainly work towards regaining our tolerance to, is eating plenty of that plant fiber. Okay. A couple of other things before we wind up, because I see that we're coming close to the end here. The food additive titanium dioxide likely has more toxic effects than we thought. So this is something that I've railed against for some time. It is rather controversial. This titanium dioxide can be found in as many as 11,000 products in the US, and is thought to increase the risk of diabetes, obesity, and other health issues. It's going to be more present, obviously, in ultra processed foods. It's used to make foods more whiter or to enhance other colors. So it's typically going to be in all these junk foods like candy bars and M&Ms, or what we call Smarties here in Canada, in cookies, etc. They're also used in non-stick ceramic pans as well. Actually, the EU banned titanium dioxide for food use in 2022 because it was shown to be a likely neurotoxin. An immunotoxin can cause intestinal lesions and potentially damage genes. Nonetheless, in North America, in the United States, the regulatory regime continues to allow titanium dioxide in our diet, in different healthcare products, in toothpastes, in different cosmetic products. And you need to be aware of that and make sure that you're not consuming that. It's another toxin on top of all the other toxins that we're being exposed to, all the microplastics that are everywhere, the different types of endocrine disrupting agents that are found in our diet, from plastic packaging, from our plastic clothing. So it's just one more thing that you need to be aware of. And, it's sort of interesting to kind of look at what's happening in the States, because it seems like the food safety regimen is being dismantled. To what end or what purpose, I'm not exactly sure why. Cynically, just so that corporations continue to, make more profit. But something that if regulatory agencies, if governments are not going to stand up for our health, then it's something that we need to be aware of and make sure that we make the right choices. And that means avoiding sources of titanium dioxide in the diet. And then lastly, this was an article here entitled "Premenstrual Dysphoric Disorder Harms Relationships for Both Sufferers and Their Partners." This study came out in early May. So it's estimated that 2% of people who menstruate are thought to have premenstrual dysphoric disorder. I would say it's probably higher than that, but I guess it depends on what you're classifying as a dysphoric disorder. We would describe it as PMS. I think most women that I've met, that I've worked with, have some degree of PMS, somewhere on a scale between 3 and 11, if we're using a scale of 0 to 10. It's very uncommon for a woman to have no symptoms whatsoever, but hopefully those symptoms are relatively manageable and are not too debilitating. They might include things like bloating and breast tenderness, maybe some back pain, especially during menstruation, but also can include things like digestive problems and brain fog, mood swings, anger, anxiety, depression, even suicidal ideation. So I think this is an important factor, and it's something that I think can have a big impact on relationships. So this was one study that showed that if you're in a relationship with someone that has this premenstrual dysphoric disorder, not only does your partner suffering, but typically you would suffer as well, that you have a lower quality of life overall. And so it is something of a red flag when in a relationship one of the partners suffers from this. It's very likely going to impact the other person as well, and affect the overall quality of that relationship, maybe leading to more stress, more tension, perhaps a breakup. And the difficult thing is often how it kind of shifts. There may be a shift where things are relatively upbeat and positive around ovulation, but then during the luteal phase things kind of crash and things get worse. And it's not uncommon for there to be the same type of arguments and problems that occur in during the luteal phase, with great regularity, and that can place a lot of stress on relationships. What I want to say, what's relevant about this, is that this is definitely treatable. I haven't come across any case of what we call PMS, or premenstrual dysphoric disorder, that is not treatable. It's definitely treatable. It's important to unwind it and figure out the different types, what they might be suffering, whether it's related to anxiety or cravings, depression, pain, edema, or some combination, or all of those different things. And they're all linked to hormonal dysregulation. Typically, a lot of that is focused around the health of the liver, because it's the liver's job to balance those hormone levels, to take hormones out of circulation, to eliminate them. And that in turn is dependent upon gut health and the gut microbiome, because if you have an unhealthy gut microbiome and your body's trying to eliminate these hormones just to maintain balance, if you've got an unhealthy gut microbiome, then those hormones bound up in the stool will be broken down and reabsorbed back into the bloodstream. So the function of the liver and the health of the microbiome are absolutely essential. And of course, we have some fantastic herbs that are used to balance hormones. And typically, for most women that are suffering from premenstrual dysphoric disorder, it's related to some problem of ovulation and the sustaining of progesterone levels during the luteal phase. And so my strategy typically is throughout the cycle, when the woman stops bleeding until she starts bleeding, I'll provide some type of liver support to help maintain the function of the liver. And then just before or with ovulation, I'll recommend some herbs to help to balance the luteal phase, to support the luteal phase, so we don't get this precipitous crash leading to this dysphoric disorder. And so herbs like Vitex and Peony and Rehmannia, Verbena, etc. are some of my favorites that I would use in combination with herbs that help to support the liver, like dandelion root, like turmeric, like Chinese buchlorum or chai hu. And it's very treatable. Also, additional supplements like the vitamin B complex and magnesium can also be very helpful in this equation as well. So I hate to see it. I hate to see people suffer, and I hate to see that stress in relationships when it is eminently treatable. It's something that we can do something about. And so if that's you, if you suffer through this, or you're in a relationship where this is a recurrent pattern, reach out to someone that has the experience, whether it's me or someone else, to help you sort this out, to figure it out. And you'll be surprised that just in a few months of treatment, you can dramatically shift things, such that the PMS might not disappear completely, but you can take it down from the 11, where it was before, down to a 2 or 3, which means it's completely manageable, and something that both people in the relationship can take in stride, accommodate, and then move on from, because it's of minimal duration and of minimal impact. Okay, so that's it for me. I'm going to wind things up for today and wind things up for this season. So thank you so much if you spent your time listening to me on CJMP on 90.1 FM. Also, if you want to subscribe for the fall, go to dogwithbotanical.com/subscribe. We will start up again in September. So if I'm able to get more subscribers over the summer, that would be so helpful. It gives me a lot more time and inspiration to focus on this particular project, which is competing for other things in my life. So your support is definitely welcome. And then if you want to see this particular podcast online, you can go to my YouTube channel, youtube.com/Todd Caldecott, where you will find the playlist for The Whole Itself Remains. Please subscribe and share with your friends, and hopefully we can get this podcast rolling. So thank you so much for participating and listening. I look forward to connecting with you in a few months. Until then, I hope you have a fantastic summer, or if you are on the other side of the equator, I hope you have a pleasant and joyful winter. Until then, take care.